maybe point to another, but I'm here. So, welcome everyone. I'm really excited to have everyone here, especially friends, family as well. So, this is my dossier style dissertation defense on understanding the relationship between space utilization and student satisfaction on university campuses. So just to give a brief overview of where we're going to go today, talk a little bit about the problem practice that I decided to study for the past 3.5 years, a focal point on the research question, discussing a little bit about my positionality, my frameworks, particularly my theoretical framework and how it transformed to my conceptual framework, the study design, the instrumentation that I approached it with, as well as discussing the findings and then synthesizing that into how we answer that research question that we have discussed throughout this time. So one of the biggest challenges that practitioners, especially in the field of higher education, are focused on is this idea of student-centered facilities and ultimately how to invest and enhance them. But there's often a clear misalignment or between how managers design and allocate space versus how students use and experience that space. And honestly, this disconnect can often lead to overcrowded areas, underutilized locations, and sometimes in some capacities decrease student satisfaction with the campus environment. When we talk about the consequences in relation to it, there's two clear consequences that we see. The first is really where individuals or campus managers focus their attention on seeing wasted investments and ultimately a push for constraints on financial resources, especially in today's world. And ultimately, the potential for an unsatisfactory student experience, especially when connecting to space on campus. This leads me to the research question that I explored. What is the relationship between university space utilization and student satisfaction within the student center? To start with, I want to make sure I spend a little time to position myself within the context of this research and with the context of myself. So I'm a practitioner and scholar for 10 years working in higher education as a full-time administrator and 3 years as a doctoral student. I see myself as an insider, particularly at the subject university I'm looking at. I'm a former student from 2007, so you probably can guess how old I might be as well as currently a current administrator. One thing I found over the past few years as an insider is that I'm seen as a student-centered advocate, someone who is enhancing all university experiences to the betterment of students as well. I'm also in this case having to focus my attention on having a lot of reflexive or really reflection in my process. Because I've had such a deep institutional experience here at the subject university, I often need to spend a great deal of time focusing my attention on the potential biases I may hold and even the potential influence that I have. Looking at particularly the theoretical framework, I wanted to start to nest the research that I'm focusing in on using Brofenberner's 1977 ecological systems theory. This particular framework allowed me to focus my attention on examining one of the key subjects of the research, the student, and looking at how the student interacts with the unique environment, particularly in space on university campuses. Along those lines, we looked at it from the microsystem, the student's interaction with other faculty, administrators, and peers in university space, to a more higher mesosystem, which is focusing the attention on looking at how the university ecosystem impacts university space. And particularly, a second subject that we look at is campus managers, and ultimately the decision-making factors that help them to decide how space is managed and reallocated. Beyond that, in the exosystem, we look tremendously at what we call locale classification, which is defined as the location at which a university is located. In this case, the subject university is located within a city environment. And above that, within the macro system, we look at higher education trends and particularly looking at how the trends currently in higher education are impacting how universities function. And above all of that, looking at particularly in the past 4 to 5 years, looking at how the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted students' interactions on campus, but also students' interactions with space on campus. Ultimately, For particularly focusing on this study, we wanted to spend a lot of time focusing on the microsystem and mesosystem. And so the transition of the microsystem and mesosystem will be seen through the initiation of the conceptual framework. Within the conceptual framework, I spent a great deal of time examining, for example, how campus managers function and work with certain organizational pressures. This is based on the campus management framework from Den Heiher, who organized the idea that different perspectives ultimately lead to different pressures that campus managers must have to design space effectively on campus. They start with organizational pressures, which is designing space to stimulate collaboration, financial pressures, which look to design space to either decrease costs or increase value within space, physical pressures that are focused on reducing footprint or being sustainable on campus, as well as functional pressure, which is really focused on designing space to support user activities and student satisfaction. As you can see, the student interactions particularly are, or the microsystem is located on the very bottom, which is focusing on space and location, looking at how positive social and physical interactions in space are impacting students' satisfaction. But then on the top of that, campus managers are seen as a part of the mesosystem, ultimately functioning as decision makers that can affect how space is used and ultimately focusing there on space utilization as well. Some other things to note that I think is important, especially within the conceptual framework, is that there's often feedback on space that we are questioning how that comes back to campus managers constantly. We are often trying to examine how feedback from space gets to campus managers. And so this will be an area of focus. Now, while I've admitted that the mesosystem and microsystem will be examined, this does not necessarily mean that other elements of Brofenberner's ecological system theory that's nested within my research won't come up within our research as well. So I'd like everyone to keep that in the back of their minds as well. Now, originally, when starting the study, I presented the research as looking at sequential research design, seeing that I would focus my attention on campus manager interviews, starting from there, then utilizing that data to build upon my observational study, and eventually looking at the Genzer Master Plan Survey, which was administered in March of 2024, and eventually triangulating and mixing the data together. However, after some reflection, and honestly, since I had sent over my actual dissertation, it came to my thought process that perhaps my study looked more like a convergent research design. And in that case, understanding that the observational study, for example, and really I should say the Gansu Master Plan Survey really happened during March of 2024, but then utilizing some themes that came out of my campus manager interviews, I would be basically mixing the data throughout that process and also seeing how they interwove within the observational study. So in this case, I'm proposing that my new resign or revised design is really centered on the idea that after some reflection and time with the data, beyond simply, the beginning of the study, which happened roughly about a year ago till now, that it's become more convergent in nature than more parallel. And so I'm open to obviously having that discussion a little bit more, and to be honest, to revise my actual paper in that kind of capacity as well. Along those lines, the instrumentation does not, however, change. First, we had our campus manager interviews, which was interviews with four different campus managers. They're semi-structured, about 40 minutes long, and recorded via Zoom and transcribed using Zoom as well. An observational study, which was an observation of two physical spaces within the student center, utilizing what we considered a standardized checklist of quantitative and qualitative measures, utilizing an iOS app known as Freeform to sketch and create different field notes as well, as well as the Gensler Master Plan Survey, which was administered in March of 2024 and captured students' perceptions on space accessibility, or really access, functionality, and the campus experience. This particular survey had Likert and open-ended questions, but the idea behind it was that we would spend a lot of time doing more of a secondary data analysis because the data was already administered. The rationale for using the Gensler Master Plan Survey was really primarily because many universities today often are doing surveys like this consistently. And so we wanted to try to create a more realistic experience from our research as well. So to start with talking about a little bit about the findings and where we kind of started from and where we're going, the campus manager interviews had some very interesting findings. First, you'll notice that here we started with utilizing predetermined codes, particularly the same codes that came from Denheimer's research on campus management framework, where we started to use deductive codes on strategic thinking or the strategic code, which is focusing on statements that really focus on how a university is enhancing their institutional strategy around the university goals. Financial goals, or financial codes, which is focusing on statements that are focusing on economic and financial health of a division or of a unit of a university. Functional goals, which are more related to space and how a space is used and who uses that space. And finally, physical goals, which are really statements focused on the infrastructure and different types of space that are on campus. So utilizing those initial interviews and initial codes, I coded the 4 interviews that were conducted. And throughout that process, we were able to identify a couple of key emerging themes. The first theme that emerged from the interviews was that campus managers were concerned over access and availability of space for students, discussing things such as different limitations on space and physical limitations. The second was conflicts over space prioritization. So tensions, for example, in who owns space, decision-making authority, and who gets the priority for space on campus. The third was identity crisis of the university center or the student center, I should say. And so this is where there's often confusion about how and changes of how the building's intended identity and function is. So in this particular case, we noticed that there was moments where administrators here felt that the identity of the building wasn't sure. Is it a student center? Is it a center for classes? What is this center and what is this supposed to look like as well? There was the post-COVID shift. So what was interesting was that the administrators made it very clear that COVID had an impact on student interactions on campus. So there were shifts in student behavior, spatial needs, and focusing on hybrid learning and post-pandemic norms. And finally, programming versus personal use. And there was concerns that administrators felt that there was times where student programming may interfere with students who may be needing private or quiet space for their work as well. You'll notice that the highest number of quotes that we found was conflicts over space prioritization for administrators as well. Just to kind of give a different context around it, I wanted to share a couple of different quotes that came from our interviews. So, for example, participant one, who was from Student Affairs, identified the idea of the COVID shift, saying that that even as a commuter, I'm not going to leave campus just for an online class sandwiched between two-person ones. I'm looking for that place to be, to live on campus, essentially. They also mentioned the idea of this identity crisis, so that the initial building was supposed to be entirely a student center. So this has often left a challenge for the folks within student affairs, but also recognizing there could be challenges beyond what that space looks like. Participant 4 from design and construction also reflected on access and availability of space, that they felt that there was overutilization in their lounges, and then not enough space for them, for students to reserve space, or even, and in some cases, and this is something critical that I noted, that often than not, students will leave their bags on chairs just to make sure no one else claims it. So I wanted us to keep that in the back of our minds as we continue throughout the process of looking at our different forms of the observational study and other pieces. Participant 2 in student affairs also noted that programming versus the issue of programming versus personal space, that the idea that there could be forms of displacement that occurs. And participant 3 in design and construction also noted that space prioritization, for example, that while students are there to lounge and to gather with friends, that there could be a concern that it's not their main focus here, that we need to make sure that we have enough study spaces for classrooms, which I thought was a very interesting perspective that was presented as well. Along those lines, we also conducted observational studies, and these observational studies occurred in 2 locations on campus. So the first was what was referred to as the second floor living room, and the second was referred to as the third floor coffee house. Across a week in January 2025, observations occurred. For the second floor living room, 17 observations concerned, and on the third floor coffee house, 18 did. So just to give a little context on how these observations occurred, utilizing an iOS app or Apple app known as Freeform app, which is done through an iPad, we sketched the actual layouts of each of these spaces, and we actually conducted these in a capacity of showcasing where people were sitting, how they were sitting, where they were occupied, where they're not occupied, where they were sitting at tables, and ultimately when they were sitting at couches. We did these for over 36 times, and the drawings were quite intense. So this is just a quick example of a couple of them here as well that I'll have included for this presentation as well. What we found actually, what was interesting, in the second floor living room was two sets of findings, both quantitative and qualitative. Looking at total occupancy, we saw 137 as a total occupancy level, with an average occupancy rate of 35.6% or 49 students at a time. Foot traffic, which is the number of students that were walking in between the spaces, were about 43 students per half hour. Using a Pearson's correlation, I wanted to test a linear relationship between two different continuous variables, foot traffic as well as space occupancy or occupancy rate. And what we discovered was that there was a positively correlation between the number of students who were passing through a space and the number of students who stayed within that space at a time, meaning that students were passing through those spaces consistently. What was important to note was that while this was important to note that we looked at it from a student to seat perspective, the qualitative findings were quite interesting. We noticed that there was high individual use within the mornings, that there was significant group work that happened throughout the day, but particularly in the middle of the day where students were coming out of courses, it appears to be. And that students ultimately moved furniture around. They often adapted the space to their needs. They often looked to claim space by utilizing their own bags and their own belongings to extend what I like to call control over a space, meaning they may sit in one chair but may throw their bags elsewhere. And students would often move furniture to make that work for them. And ultimately, on January 31st, what one distinctive observation that I made was that during event programming, a disruption occurred where students were asked to leave a space in order for a facilities group to set up a space for the next following day, as I discovered. The third floor coffee house was also interesting. In a similar fashion, conducting the same form of looking at the research through using three form, total occupancy rate was around 190, and the average occupancy rate was 26.2% or 50 students. There was still a moderate correlation between foot traffic and occupancy rate utilizing a Pearson's correlation test. But what was interesting about the qualitative findings here was that there's a lot more socializing. Students were often utilizing the space to eat because we call it a coffee house, and there is actually a coffee space there, a business that is there. There was frequent furniture moving, meaning students were moving chairs around to make space for group work, which is quite fascinating. But there was actually lower traffic in terms of students moving through the space as well. And the key thing is that also on January 31st, there was an event that was being set up. And so a part of that section of that space was blocked off so that facilities could set up that space again. And so that definitely looked like it caused a disruption, and the numbers for that particular day were a little lower than projected originally. Now, the last piece of instruments that I looked at was the Gensler Master Plan Survey from March of 2024. And in this case, and excuse me if this is hard to read, my expectation was I'm just going to explain it. But utilizing a deductive qualitative content analysis, I looked at the Gensler Master Plan Survey. I received this data in an aggregate format, so I did not receive individual students, but I looked at the open-ended responses from the survey and decided to develop a categorization matrix where I actually connected the themes that was established through the qualitative interviews done through the campus managers to see how students were aligning with those same themes. So the same themes that were originally discussed were also applied here as well. And what we discovered is that the most frequent theme that students cared about the most was accessibility and availability of space, with 7 out of 10 responses. What was fascinating to me here was that the least connected theme was this identity crisis. And it was interesting to me, and I was trying to understand as to why the identity crisis did not seem to come up here. And I think primarily it's because the administrators that we examined earlier on in the research primarily came it from a position of the history behind that building and how the building was established. While the students that we were discussing or really seeing from March of 2024 was mostly focused on function and as well as just understanding. Plus, the survey did not necessarily ask questions related to the identity and the utilization of space. They just asked how students experience that space. Well, some emerging trends that came from also this research was that there's definitely a need for hybrid learning and for more private study areas. Similar to the interviews, I also want to look at some of the feedback that was also gathered from the Genzo Master Plan survey, and this is just from some of the students who were talking about their needs. For example, students saying that space for students taking online synchronous classes is sorely needed, and that there's a demand for it. On the same time, Response ID 007 also argued that there's not enough private study spaces. And being a commuter with sometimes large gaps in between classes, I like to know I can find a space where I can study and relax. Along those lines, I also wanted to to stress that we wanted to look also at what is the experience of students post-COVID. And so this question also came up about how students are a student's preference on how their type of interactions on campus occur. And it turns out that close to between 30 to 46% of students have either a mix of remote or in person or 100% remote experiences or are looking for that. So it's very clear that there has been a change in terms of how students interact on campus, which also, connects and also really connects with some of the earlier feedback received. I also wanted to mention before going into the next phase of this is that it was interesting to note that students are saying that there's not enough space on campus, that administrators are also saying that. But when we look at it from a quantitative perspective, there's still occupancy. But it's interesting because it's occupancy from a sense of us one to one. But if you look at it in terms of how students look at belonging and how they want to be on campus, it's very clear that students actually have a certain sense of what ownership is in terms of space. And so that one seat may feel like you need two or three more to feel like this is my space on campus. So I think it's very critical for us to sort of note that as we go into this next phase of how we look at this question. So what we uncovered is a couple of key things, and I think that are very important for us to note. That students really at the subject university are experiencing a misalignment between how space is planned versus how it's used. That these five emerging themes are abundantly clear that access availability matters, that students are looking for quiet and flexible and comfortable spaces, that there are space conflicts, that events can displace students, whether unintentionally or not, that there is an identity crisis from the sense of how administrators see how the function of space should be, but it may not necessarily illuminate from a student's perspective. That programming versus personal use, that these events can dominate informal use where students can just come out and hang, and that post-COVID actually is something that is being recognized and happening. That the changes in academic culture, the changes in environment are becoming clear that students have more fragmented schedules, or they're seeking that from an access perspective as well. So in terms of answering the research question, I wanted to just try something a little different and wanted to really see, is there a way for us to really bring in these two perspectives into one? So this may look new, I promise it's not. It's just a different perspective. But there's an institutional lens when we look at how space and student satisfaction is being looked at, right? That there's this top-down approach from leadership, very clear. That from some of the interviews that I've made, that participant three and then higher argues that there is a top-down approach to how leadership looks at making decisions related to space. That space is serving multiple functions, that we are trying to be innovative with how we look at space, that there's a reallocation of informal space that's happening constantly. And we saw that through the disruptions that occur through the observations, that we're driven to modernize space as much as possible, which goes back to the original concepts of studying that there are financial constraints and often different forms of constraints that are making it difficult to keep up. And that there's also limitations by physical constraints, that there's spaces that just can't be expanded more unless you want to build another building or more space. And that sometimes student input may be perceived post-implementation, which I think was really seen through the fact that I'm utilizing a post-occupancy survey, such as the Gensler Master Plan survey. Um, and as we go forward, there's also this other theme of lived experiences for students in space, right? And I think that's important that there's desire for consistent, hybrid-friendly, informal spaces that's becoming more clear as we go forward, that students use space for rest, this connection, to have autonomy, to feel like they have a space, to have ownership, that they want to reconfigure space to meet personal and group needs, that commuters are often affected by the unpredictability of space, and that satisfaction is driven by this idea of ownership, comfort, and not just necessarily only about access alone. Which also means there's this gap that we're looking at. That misalignment ultimately leads to this frustration and adaptation. And, I recall during the observations when a student was asked to leave, there was this sense of sadness, of frustration, of like, where do I go from here? And it's clear I don't have the answer when I was looking there, but it was interesting to see that facial expression. That students will ultimately reshape space to meet their needs. The constant moving of furniture. It was also interesting that in the second floor lobby, on the second floor living room, that I was told midway through my observations that the setup was not the correct setup, which I thought was really fascinating. And then the next day, the setup changed again as well. And that space planning can ultimately have an impact on space identity, a student's rhythm or experiences, and the sense of belonging on campus, which relates back to the research that I've been looking at as well. So, of course, the last thing I'll point out is as a practitioner in this field, I really want to understand how do I best offer recommendations and implications for this research that I've been working on. The first that I really want to spend time with saying is that more space does not necessarily equal a better experience. We often need to spend more time focusing our attention on comfort, belonging, and consistency. Because as we can see, space in itself for students one-to-one, occupancy rates never reach above 50%. But at the same time, students are still saying that there's not enough space. So we have to kind of figure out how do we create the idea of a better experience for them. The second is to continue to engage, or if not re-engage students within the design of space, having walkthroughs, using a design charrette, which is really a collaborative and intensive workshop focused on problem solving and generating different solutions, particularly for space. Some things more practical, which I think are just as important, is improving communication about changes with space, right? And so, one thing that could be a very simple fix that would help, or not necessarily a fix, but could be something that could help in this process, is to really offer something that tells students, hey, this space is not going to be available from this time to this time. That is in itself a very powerful thing that will tell students, hey, it's okay, you're not going to have this space, we'll help you find another. And also creating what we call protected hours, whereby space may not necessarily be programmed at these times so that students have a space of their own that they know consistently, this is my space to belong. Another idea that was thinking that came up in my research, or at least in my conversations, was kind of doing like pop-up lounges where you actually create a space that is very different, where students can test out a space, test out a different space to hang out, just to see what the interactions are. And ultimately, the last thing is to continue to include inclusionary approaches and exploring how space and how autonomy, equity, and community are going to be integrated within those realms as well. With that being said, these are some of my references here, and I thank you all so much for listening. I'm sorry if it got a little long there, but I appreciate everyone who was able to join today as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kevin. Um, Again, folks, friends and family, as I mentioned, if anyone has a pressing question, I'm happy to take a moment and let you ask that question for Kevin or of Kevin. If not, what we're going to do is I'm going to move you all into a breakout room. What that's going to mean for anyone who's new to Zoom, that you'll see it say you're invited to go to a particular room. You will all be in the same room. So if you just go ahead and click the move to button, it will take you there. Okay. If not, I think I'll be able to move everyone, but I can't promise. So we will move you over there. and Kevin will join you after he's done answering some questions from the committee.
It's a lot of stuff happening right now. What is going on
You,
here?
you missed Andre had something even more spectacular, but we had to tone it down.
We had to step it back a bit. So I'm just waiting for a couple of other folks to, they're just going to automatically come back in 13 seconds. So give us one short moment.
No problem.
Eb.
Hi.
Well, there's two Ebonies on the call.
Oh, I didn't know that.
There's an Ebony Calvin that I work with, and then Ebony Martin, who's would have been one of my good friends for well, over what? I can't remember now, 25 years or something like that.
You want to call it forever. I think you want to call it forever.
I think it's been forever.
Well, folks, I want to introduce you all to the newest member of the doctoral club and Dr. Kevin James. Congratulations on completing your successful dissertation.
Congratulations.
Yes, wonderful job, Kevin. Wonderful job, Dr. James.
Dr. James,
Dr.
congratulations.
Kevin James.
Congratulations, Dr. James.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for joining us. Kevin, you did an amazing job. We have, generally a couple of notes. You're going to be getting feedback from the committee. You'll have some notes that come just around the tense of some verbs and some other small things. We generally talked through in the question and answer, but very few notes for you. So you hopefully, with the celebration going on right now, you should be able to, number one, sleep. And number two, celebrate extensively with your friends and family. So congratulations, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today.
No, thank you all. I really am grateful for everyone who was to join today. And this has been a dream of mine for 17 years of my life. So I'm so grateful. This has been a moment coming. So thank you all so much.
Congratulations.
Yay,
Congratulations again.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you, everyone.
And thank you to the committee. Thanks for being so encouraging to Kevin this whole time.
Yeah, thank
Thank you to
you.
my parents and Martha for sticking by me as I went through this.
Thank you.
All right, folks. I think we're disappearing now.
Congratulations, Kevin.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Very
Mom.
proud of you.
Thank you.
Mom.
We have
Thank
people
you
logged
so
in from
much.
all over the world.
Yeah. From Nigeria, from France, from London. I'm so grateful. Thank you all.
Well done, Kevin.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. I guess I'll see everyone soon.
Yes, again.